Good evening. I'd like to call to order the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for May 7th, 2018. Let the record show that all of the councilors are here except for Mr. Pond, and I believe he'll be just a few minutes late, so he'll be joining us in a few minutes. I'd like to begin tonight with citizen comment on any agenda items, and we've got a sign-in sheet coming to me. Thank you. So if when I call your name, if you would please come to the podium, give us your first name and last name, and spell your last name, and give us your address, and then continue to talk. And our first speaker is Michael Pate, and Charlie Myers is on deck.
All right, Michael Pate here, P-A-T-E. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. I represent the Electric Guard Dog and Camping World concerning electric security fences. I'm just going to give you a little primer here on how these things work so you'll be familiar with it really quick. Basically what we're looking at here is a battery-powered device. Two 12-volt batteries or a 12-volt battery. Two 6-volt batteries or a 12-volt battery power the device. Basically what we're doing is we're upcharging the batteries to about 7,000 volts over a time of 1.3 seconds. Once that charger's loaded, we release that power down the line on the interior fence line back to an alarm panel. And we're looking for a nice, clean return on the alarm, on the charge. If we don't get a nice, clean return on the charge, we set the alarm off. both audibly on the site and silently back to Columbia, South Carolina, where I go through a call list. Let's say Larry's number one on my call list. I'm calling him at 2 o'clock in the morning. Larry, I got a break on the northern perimeter, 20 feet from the northeast corner. I can measure the breaks down to about 10 feet. What do you want to do? We also have cameras associated with these devices, so we can actually sit there with his Wi-Fi, bring up that fence line, look at it. Hey, we just had a big ice storm over here in Wheat Ridge, took out that big oak tree on the corner, knocked down the fence, let's lock it up and go back to bed. Or I got 5 guys in hoodies and a flatbed truck robbing me blind, please call the local police department. It's called a verified alarm. Police love verified alarms. There are a lot of safety features built into these devices. First of all, we always have a perimeter fence up. In other words, there has to be another fence up before we ever install the electric security fence. So someone actually has to be going through the fence to even hit the thing. We also have it signed, always in English, always in Spanish. And we have 34 other languages we also put on these signs throughout the United States of America. It's a very safe device. We actually have this device tested by a nationally recognized testing laboratory. That's called a NERDL in shorthand. NERDL, basically the most famous you all know about is UL. UL happens to be one of 14 NERDLs that are approved by OSHA. We use a group out of Germany called TUV Rhineland, and they test our device, and they also authorize us to manufacture all these devices in our manufacturing facility in Columbia, South Carolina, and test and label these devices under their supervision. And they basically audit us a couple of times a year to make sure we do everything right, to make sure these things are safe. Camping World came to us really early on as Kettleson a couple of years ago, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. Mr. Kettleson was suffering horrendous losses, up to $250,000. At that time, we really weren't able to do anything in the city. Camping World took over, and they basically are suffering the same types of losses. They just had 4 campers broken into last weekend and vandalized, and this is basically a weekly occurrence. They have some people are breaking in over there, basically living in these campers, starting fires, vandalizing them, ripping out all the TVs, electronics, and things like that, and it's really unsustainable to these folks. It's also a danger to the school that's next door. They've actually had 3 shutdowns, lockdowns on the school because of people going through the schoolyard trying to break into Randy Kettleson and Camping World's business. So what we're trying to do is harden this site, make sure that no one else can break into it, save this business for the city, and actually save the police a lot of money, because they don't have to go out there and investigate these things anymore. So that's basically what we do. That's how we do it. And if you have any questions, I'm basically the so-called expert on these things, so I travel all over the country doing this. And if you have any questions at all, I'd be glad to answer them.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
So you work for the electric fence company? Is that who you work for?
That's correct.
So this is battery operated. So it could have a timer, though, is what I'm saying. Could have a timer to turn it on and off?
Oh, yeah, it's a very sophisticated device now. You can basically turn it off and on, arm it up, arm it down, just like any alarm system. In other words, you can turn it on with an app that's on your phone. I can tell you who turned it off, when they turned it off, who turned it on, when they turned it on, what time they did it, and we do that a lot. And a remote access for these devices is critical, especially to the trucking world. You know, basically, in a trucking company, you've got folks coming in and out of these places 24/7, 365. So we actually have special codes just for the trucks that drive in and out, while we leave the rest of the thing up and alarm. But yes, we can cut it off at will, cut it on at will. It's not up 24/7, 365, unless the business demands it. And there are many businesses that do demand it, but most of them are in the trucking world.
Okay. Of course, I know that you represent Kettleson Campers in this case, but Camping World does not have this system. Is that correct?
No, they do not have it now. Once Camping World basically probably has 45 or 50 of my devices all over the country. And once they took over from Mr. Kettleson, they suffered some losses very quickly and asked us to come in. We basically gave them the background of what had happened here in the past, and that we probably had a little more rigorous effort than we usually have to basically get these things permitted. So we've engaged some folks over here on the city council. We've engaged the city to try to find a solution for these folks so they can stop the theft at Camping World.
What other methods have been tried at Kettleson? For example, have they ever tried a night watchman?
Have they tried what now?
A night watchman?
Yeah, but you can't cover the whole place. It's too large. And if you're looking at cost, you're talking about one guy over the weekends is usually going to run you somewhere around $80,000 a year. It would take 5 or 6 guys to cover that whole place. The police have stepped up over there and gone on accelerated patrols over there. You just can't stop the folks.
Do they have cameras in order to determine exactly where the break-ins happen?
They have had cameras in the past, but they haven't stopped the thing. And cameras don't. Cameras never stop a crime. They record a crime.
I'm just curious because I drove over there and I see that there's a place where there is only a wooden fence and you can just move a couple of slats and walk into the place. So I'm just wondering if they know where the weakness is in their defense.
Well, they have had incursions on that lot everywhere. They've come in the front, the sides, the back. They used to use the old hotel. They still use that as cover. They come across the schoolyard. That's where they really come from a lot, is the schoolyard. They come in the front door. They come in the back door. There's just really no particular area on that site that has not been penetrated. It's tough.
Mr. Ann?
Thank you. So some of my concerns are the school behind there. So if it has a timer, you can shut that off during the day during school hours, correct?
Yes, and that was one of the concerns of the city staff, was cutting it on and off during the school hours. And there's no problem doing that at all. So if you look at Camping World, they're basically a retail store. They don't want it on during retail store hours, so they're going to cut it off. They're going to arm it up when they leave in the evening, and they'll cut it off when they get there in the morning.
And what time does it close in the evening?
I think they go at 6 p.m. as I recall.
I think Don said 7 to 7 usually.
7 to 7? Okay. 7 to 7.
Okay, so that's a possibility of having it shut off during school hours, turn it on from 7 to 7 at night. And that would be beneficial, right, to,
Absolutely. And
Okay.
it basically gives you the weekend. So they'll be armed up during the weekend.
okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, y'all.
Our next speaker is Charlie Myers and Mike Raber on deck.
Thank you. My name is Charlie Myers, M-Y-E-R-S, and I reside at 3620 Otis Street in Wheat Ridge, District 1. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on e-bikes, e-bike policy, and I'd like to commend Parks and Rec for addressing the issue of e-bikes. And I'm with the Bike Jeffco advocacy group, Jefferson County, and we're the voice of bicyclists for Jefferson County. I'm the acting chairman, and I'm also affiliated with ATAT, or the Wheat Ridge Active Transportation Advisory Team. We've all been very interested by what's going on with e-bikes, policy, usage, the market, and so with Bike Jeffco, we brought a number of organizations in. People for Bikes out of Boulder, reps from them. We also had e-bike outfitters, and we learned a lot. First of all, it's not a fad, or it's just not going to go away. This is a growing market that's really amazing, and it's really taken off. In fact, the sales from 2016 to 2017 went up 40%. And then we also learned that of that population, 60% are retired seniors, 30% are commuters, and then 10% are using the e-bike because of some disability, medical condition. And we're understanding, we heard from e-bike outfitters that actually that group is increasing. So it has a lot of importance in terms of getting people out onto our trails, recreating, enjoying what we have in Wheat Ridge and the whole region. So, and also it may have some real impact in terms of our commuter system at some point when we see more increases there. So e-bikes are getting more people out. What we are kind of concerned with at Bike Jeffco is that we might see a patchwork of ordinances from one municipality to another. And what we're hoping, and we'd like to see Parks and Rec connect with other communities, other municipalities, and see what is going on there, and have a consistent ordinance. There's a lot going on. One other thing was, I think there was concern about reckless e-bike riders, and the surveys that have been done in Boulder and also in Jefferson County open space, that has not been validated. It has not been seen at all. And one of our next speaker is going to be speaking to really who's riding the e-bikes out there, and we'll have a comment about that. I just wanted to say the ordinance that I see here, unless I'm missing something, my time's up, no class 1, no class 2. Maybe we should be more specific. Bike Jeffco and ATAT would like to be available to help in survey, research, writing, wherever necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mike Raber, and Al Gallo is on deck.
City Council, thanks for entertaining our discussion on e-bikes. My name is Michael Raber, R-A-B as in boy, E-R, and I live at 1662 Sinton Road in Evergreen, Colorado. And I wanted to express to you as to who's actually riding these e-bikes, because I also testified at the House and the Senate subcommittees last year on this bill when it was passed. And the concern that kept coming up was, well, all these young hotshots are going to be buzzing the trails, and we don't want that. That is not who are riding the e-bikes. The people who are buzzing the trails are people on road bikes who are training for competition, and even though they should be on the roads doing that, some of them are doing it on the trails. Who's actually riding the e-bikes on the trails despite whatever the regulations are on this patchwork of regulations as you move from one municipality or one county to the other are seniors. And I can tell you I ride with a seniors group from Wheat Ridge and Arvada primarily every Monday. And when this started, a couple of the guys 3 years ago bought e-bikes for their spouses. And just so they felt comfortable in doing that, so the spouses didn't feel uncomfortable with, riding an e-bike next to somebody who didn't have an e-bike, they bought them for themselves. And over the last 3 years, all of those guys have switched primarily to e-bikes for their fun riding. And the rest of the group, over half of them, have bought e-bikes as their primary bike for their senior rides. And we're doing a lot of this on both on-road, on bike lanes, as well as the bikeways for two reasons. One is they're really fun to ride. And until you've been on one, you can't appreciate how easy it is to ride and how much fun it is and how much control you have. And the second reason is that as you age, and the majority of the people riding these, the vast majority are seniors, all of a sudden the wind and the hills no longer are a consideration when you go out on a bike ride, because you can adjust the amount of power on an e-bike to meet the conditions that you're riding in. And they're governed to not go over 20 miles an hour. So when you hit that speed, it cuts out. And so the concern with, well, these guys are really going to speed going downhill. That's not the case, because when you hit 20 miles an hour, there's no e-bike assist on it. And the same thing when you're riding at slower speeds. That electronic motor cuts out whenever you hit the brakes, whenever you stop pedaling, or there's a couple of conditions, but those are the two main ones. So when you go into a coast position, you stop pedaling, you're cornering, or you brake, it cuts the motor out, so you're not fighting the power of an electronic motor. So they're incredibly stable. And I can tell you in the last 3 years, we've had 2 bike crashes on corners, and both of them had been non-e-bike. And the other thing I will tell you is it's become the mobility device of choice for anybody with a serious illness. And 2 of my very good, highly athletic friends who are ski instructors and everything else now use the e-bike as their mobility device, because whether you have Parkinson's disease or a balance issue, you don't fall over when you're riding an e-bike. For whatever reason, it's incredibly stable. And the second thing is when you get off the e-bike, it becomes your mobility device because you lean on it, on the handlebars. So friends of mine who can't ski anymore, they can't ride their bicycles that they're used to riding, they can't even do hikes because they lose their balance and fall over, can get on an e-bike and they can walk anywhere in town using it as their crutch, and they can ride with their friends in the ride group they used to not be able to ride with because they no longer have the power, and they don't fall over like they do when they're skiing or anything else. So I tell you, it's a tremendous thing, and that's why it's growing so much popularity with the senior community. I would also like to recommend, and I was looking at where you're looking at putting the e-bike regulation in the Wheat Ridge regulations, and where it really should be referencing is 42-4-1412, because all the way 1 through 14, when we modified the bill, when we got the bill passed, that's where we put the e-bike regulations for the state of Colorado. And I think that they're a lot more specific and a lot clearer than you're referencing 42-1- I think it's 103, because that's just a general transportation subsection of the Colorado Revised Statutes. So you'd be much better focused on citing 42-4-1412. And what we did was we modified the wording in everything from subsection 1 through subsection 14 to say both bicycles and electronic assisted bicycles, and they're all subject to the same rules and regulations. So that's a lot more clear than what you have in the paperwork that I looked at. Any questions that you have? Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Al Gallo.
Al Gallo, Gallo, and I'm at 6685 West 30th Avenue in District 1. I want to say thank you for bringing this topic up. It is confusing. I am an e-bike rider, and it is a little confusing when I am driving and riding my bike around town. Where can I ride it? Where can't I ride it? And so forth. I have a very strong urge to ride safely, so riding on streets sometimes isn't the most advantageous way to do that. I would like to say Clear Creek is an awesome trail, and it is truly a jewel of Wheat Ridge. And it's great for everybody, pedestrians, bikers, strollers, families that enjoy the parks along the route. Clear Creek right now for me is very inclusive. I mean, it's very inviting to pretty much everybody. And it allows more people. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. So the e-bike allows more people to ride a bike, like our previous two speakers have said. More people can get on bikes who maybe had to give up biking because of medical issues, disabilities, age, just exercising ability, and so forth. And it really does bring a lot of joy back to bike riding. But like everything we do, there are some bad actors out there, and I do ride Clear Creek quite a bit. I actually commute to Aurora, so I take Clear Creek to Sand Creek and Flat River out to Aurora. About a 24-mile each way trip, and the e-bike has really allowed me to do that. But if I had to ride on the streets again, if I had to come up Martin Luther King to 29, I might really think twice about riding my bike. So having Clear Creek available to me is great. Kind of pretty much touched on everything. And again, I want to kind of bring up the whole piece of the assist. So it's a pedal assist. And I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with what the three classes are that have been defined. Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. I know we alluded to them, but Class 1 is bike will go up to 20 miles an hour, cuts out at 20, there's no throttle. Class 2 bike, again, same thing, but it has a throttle. And Class 3 is pretty much anything above that. Those bikes can go 30, 40 miles an hour with an assist and with the throttle and so forth. I think it would make sense to have Class 1 and Class 2 available on Clear Creek, as well as some of the other trails here in Wheat Ridge, as well as the surrounding neighborhoods and so forth. Mine is a Class 2 bike. I do have a throttle on it, and it helps me when I'm at a stop sign and I get going. It's nice to hit the throttle and kind of get that going. Because usually you have to do a couple rotations of the pedals for the assist to kick in. So that's kind of the three classes of them. So if you have questions about those, please don't hesitate to ask any of us. And by the way, I did bring my e-bike up today, so if any of you want to go see it, want to take a ride in the parking lot with it, you are more than welcome to give it a try. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's all of the speakers that I had signed up tonight. Is there anyone here in the audience that would like to speak who's not on the list? You're free to come forward now. Okay. Seeing none, we will close our public comment and move to our agenda. Item number 1 is staff reports. Mr. Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Joyce Manwaring, our Parks and Rec Director, is here to give you a brief update on this and looking for consensus if we should bring this forward for an ordinance change.
Thank you, Patrick. So what you have is the first draft of an amendment to Chapter 17 to allow e-bikes on the trail. I have made note of all the public comment, and we can vet that further and make sure our ordinance is covering everything it needs to. We did keep it simple, and that was to define e-bikes, and then we have posted speeds on the trail. But again, I've made note of the public comment, and we'll make sure we've got everything covered fully. We'd like to bring that forward for first reading in late June.
goes on. Mr. Ann?
Thank you. Have we checked the ordinances in the surrounding area, like Arvada, Lakewood, Golden?
I haven't specifically asked them. I have another Jeffco Parks Director meeting on Wednesday, and it'll be discussed.
Okay, because I'd like to kind of know what they've been doing. I'm in support of this. I just want to be mindful that, like you said, we have the speeds posted. Also, on the Class 1, was that with a throttle? Without a throttle. But Class 2 is 20 miles with a throttle. Class 3 goes, you said 30 to 40, pretty much? Okay, and with...
Colorado statute, the 42-4-1412, Class 3 are limited to 28 miles an hour. So, and where the main application is for mountain bikes that will need the more power, because as the category goes up, generally the power will go up. But the first two, Category 1 and Category 2, under law, maximum of 20 miles an hour. Category 3 is a maximum of 28. Doesn't mean they don't have the power to go higher, but if there's a modification, it's an illegal modification, whether it's done after you bought the device or prior. So we're quite strict on that because of the concern. Until we have more experience with how people are acting with e-bikes, we set it at 28 miles an hour. But they definitely could go faster, but they don't. And I can tell you in Europe, they definitely have theirs set faster because it's the primary commuting transport device in Europe at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Additional comments, questions? Ms. Dozeman?
Thank you. What is the demand of the e-bikes on the trails? Have you had a lot of people reach out?
I don't have a specific number of people. We just know, and based on the first speaker's public comment, that they're becoming very popular, and by not allowing them on our trail, I don't believe we're matching. Clear Creek is a regional trail system, so we want to make sure we have consistency to Golden and to Denver, and that we allow as many people as possible to enjoy the trail.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm okay with us having e-bikes both on our streets and on our trails. I guess as it relates to the Clear Creek, have we ever done any sort of analysis of the traffic signs we have on the Clear Creek or the markings on the pavement to be consistent across our trail system so that there is that both that signage or yield signs or stop signs or using trails wisely, the type signage that sort of allows people, if we're going to have more traffic on those trails, we need to have more traffic enforcement as well. So do we have any sort of uniform signage program for the trails?
On just our trail, or you mean in conjunction with Golden?
Just as it relates to our trails, or how that relates to what Golden's doing and how we connect with that.
Well, we have consistent signage on our trail, so we're consistent about what we put up and what it looks like and how it follows our park rules and regulations. But there is a move, it has been for a couple of years, it's unfunded, to have the visitor on the Clear Creek Trail have a consistent experience. So the county right now is heading that up, and I believe they're meeting next month. And that included signage to include the Peaks to Plain Trail that goes all the way up the canyon. So it is the Clear Creek Trail, but the county would like it to be known across the metro area as the Peaks to Plain Trail. So we'll start looking at that this year.
And as far as a median or a yellow line down the middle, has that been considered, or could we look at?
We do have that in a few spots, but not everywhere.
Thank you.
Mr. Ann?
If this is going to be a growing demand, my thought is the batteries are rechargeable, correct? Are they lithium-ion batteries? And do we have any waste sites now that we're thinking about? I mean, just trying to anticipate the future with this growing.
So they could recharge?
Yeah.
No, we don't right now.
Okay. All right. I'd like us to be mindful of that, too. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Dozeman?
What kind of enforcement do we have on the trails currently?
Well, it's a soft enforcement. We do ask people to follow the rules, and they're fairly well-known rules, on your left, etc. We do have sometimes bicyclists that go faster or are not safe. We have dogs off leash, those kinds of things. But we do have our CSOs, and they do visit the trail, and they do come down when called and try to have a presence there as well.
Mr. Matthews.
Who authored the ordinance?
Mr. Dahl's office.
Okay, and I'm trying to, you mentioned that we're trying to do a consistent from place to place to place. Our trails go across several different municipalities and jurisdictions. Are we going to be consistent with Aurora, or, is there, I'm asking, is there some jurisdiction that would have some authority over the entire metro area that's working on a consistent set of rules, so that it's like you drive your car into Denver and they say, well, no right turns allowed, well, we're all in trouble. Are they going to should we be adopting the state rules, or where are we at on that?
I think we referenced the Colorado Model Traffic Code for street type references. I don't believe we have one for trails across the metro area. And all of our ordinances look a little bit different. So that's why we're meeting and talking about what that consistently looks like, at least on the Clear Creek Trail.
Okay, additional questions? I've got one for you. When I look at the ordinance, it looks to me like we've made a definition for bicycle and a definition for vehicle, which includes just about everything that moves other than a wheelchair. But I don't, are all of these vehicles allowed on the trail? And
Well, I think it defines as it references to vehicles, so no motorized vehicles are allowed on the trail. We would like to address and perhaps add scooters, motorized scooters, as well as electrically assisted wheelchairs. So that's something we'll be working on in the next month.
So motorized vehicles are not allowed on the trail?
Correct.
Are these bicycles motorized vehicles?
Well, right now they don't fall under any definition, so that's why we're adjusting the ordinance.
'Cause when I
Right
look-
now, I think they would be considered a motorized vehicle.
So when I look at it, it looks like that we have these definitions of bicycle and vehicle, and then we talk about, well, you've got to obey the traffic rules, and you can't go more than 5 miles an hour. But it doesn't seem to me that we've limited the vehicles that are, any vehicle could, use this unless there's some other part of the ordinance that says that. I don't know, maybe Mr. Dahl could address
Well, I
that
believe
for us.
under Section A, it tells you can't do a motorized, for any person operating a motorized vehicle, under Section A at the top of the ordinance, but.
Well, there's no question that, it's all right, Patrick, I don't need a chair. Really, I don't need a chair. I sit down too much already. I saw that subtlety as well, and I think the intention, of course, is to define electric bicycles as bicycles. We'll probably want to clarify or distinguish between them categories 1 and 2 versus 3, because we've learned that tonight and that's helpful. But I think it'll be an easy thing as a matter of drafting to make certain that electric bicycles are not within the category of motorized vehicles that you're seeing in that other definition. That's just a matter of refining either one or both of those definitions. And clearly, we're going to need to work on the definition anyhow if we're going to make distinctions between the categories of e-bikes. So I see that problem, but that's easy to fix.
Okay, so that would, in A, it shall be unlawful for any person to operate a motorized vehicle of any description whatsoever in any park or recreation area of the city.
Yes, I see that problem, but
Okay.
what I'm saying is it's easy to fix, because what you do is you just make certain that bicycles as defined, which will include electric bicycles, aren't considered motorized vehicles. Or you put in you say
Okay.
any motorized vehicle with the exception of electric bicycles as described above, and then you're there.
Okay. Are you-
Yeah.
So
I've been
so
making
you would-
notes.
You would
That's easy
propose
to
that
do.
we would make that
Sure.
change
Yeah,
before you
that's-
bring this?
that's easy to
Okay,
do.
thank you.
You want me to sit down?
Please have a chair.
It would bother you if I kicked in. Okay.
I'm sure the rate for our attorney doubles when we, when we have you on your knees.
Oh, the first lawyer joke of the day. I thought I was going to make it through the whole day, 5 after 7. Not
You
too
know,
bad.
You just don't feel that it's at your expense, you know? Ms. Hoppy?
Thank you. I just want to say that I do support electric bicycles. The outdoor rec industry is a $28 billion industry in Colorado, and I think it's important that we are supporting that industry. And I thank you guys for putting the work into this. The one thing, Mr. Dahl, that was also kind of a wordsmithing definition thing that was kind of confusing me, is that under the definition of vehicle, it says, vehicle means any device which is capable of moving itself or being moved from place to place upon wheels or endless tracks. Vehicle includes any bicycle, but then we exclude vehicles on the parks and trails. So I think if we could clarify that a little bit, and then it goes to speak to what Mayor Starker was talking about. Otherwise, thank you very much for bringing this to us.
Mr. Matthews?
Are we getting into any kind of conflicts here with when they get off the trail? I mean, we're kind of zeroed in here on trails, but they have to ride on public roads to get to a trail. Do they now therefore have to have turn signals and licenses and a driver's license because haven't they become a motorized vehicle?
Well, I will tell you this, and it came up earlier. It's well understood that bicycles on public streets and highways have to conform to the same rules in terms of movement of traffic as your car does. Sometimes that's honored in the breach, as you know, because often there are now bills about whether bicycles really need to stop at stop signs. All the cars do, but do bicycles need to? And of course, they never do. Generally. But that's movement of traffic. And your question's a good one, which is, okay, if they're permitted on highways and they're regulated like vehicles, do they need to have the same equipment? And the answer is no. And they're allowed to be on highways, but without electrified turn signals and brake lights and whatnot. And that's been a feature of bicycle and motor vehicle regulation law in Colorado for a long time. It creates the friction that I described, but the state legislature gets to see that regularly.
Okay, so the motorized part doesn't make any
Motorized
difference. It
part
doesn't become a motorized vehicle.
No, not an e-bike would not become a motorized vehicle like a motorcycle or something. Good question.
Additional comments? Okay, thank you very much. That'll conclude item number 1.
So do we need a consensus?
Consensus?
Well, yes, we do need a consensus, you know, so let's speak
I would
up.
like to get a consensus that we ask staff to move forward with the amendment to the Chapter 17 Code of Laws concerning electrical assisted bicycles, while also taking a look at some of the discussion we've had about definition and some wordsmithing. Consensus.
Okay, that
Thank you.
passes. Now that'll conclude item number 1. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to item number 2, Harlan Street Streetscape Maintenance.
It's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, but we...
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right.
Scott Brink, our Public Works Director, is here. Well, I guess we're losing some folks. Okay. Scott, just you, right? Yep.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, hit it.
Thank you. We're bringing forward to you this evening, we'd just like to have a discussion, maybe some guidance to staff, depending on how the discussion shakes out. But Harlan Street from about 48th Avenue, about I-70, going south to 38th Avenue was put in with a streetscape several years ago, back in the early 2000s. You know, we've had some issues out there with inconsistent maintenance. In your packet here in the report, there's a lot of photographs here, I think, that kind of give you a general idea of what's out there. It's really a hodgepodge of different things. But at the time it was constructed back in the early 2000s, there was an understanding at the time that the city would maintain the hardscape, the street lights, some of these masonry features, these short retaining walls, pillars, and so forth, and that the property owners would maintain the turf areas out there. What's kind of happened over time is, well, for one thing, it's aging out there. Some of these concrete hardscape areas and retaining walls are aging. Public Works staff has done some restoration on some of those as much as we can. Sidewalks and so forth, they've maintained pretty well, but we've gone out there and repaired trip hazards, safety concerns, things like that. But as far as the softscape, the turf, the trees, it's really kind of fallen into a mismatch of disrepair. As you can see on the photographs there's some places that where there's virtually no turf, some places where it actually looks pretty good, like around the bank there where they actually put in an irrigation system and they maintain some good turf out there. And I think that's part of the issue too, is at the time the streetscape was built, there was not an irrigation system put in that we are aware of. So we just wanted to have a general discussion with council tonight, get your thoughts on this. If you'd like staff to perhaps look at this further, some options, maybe resources, we could certainly go out and put something together, what it might take to make it look better. But I wanted to mention too, you could tell from the photographs that some of the property owners have kind of just done their own thing too to make it look nicer. Some have put in some rock features, river rock, or some mulch landscaping. Some of it actually doesn't look that bad, but it looks very inconsistent out there. And so I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on this and how we might want to move forward on this.
Okay, councilors, Mr. Pond.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the topic coming forward. I think maybe a couple of study sessions ago, we were talking about some other efforts that have been put in place to to take inventory of landscape that's been installed and how it's been maintained. And so I know this may be somewhat of a separate concept or in a separate bucket, but I think it's to the same point, which is us trying to really figure out what's the right balance of taking responsibility or encouraging responsibility from property owners. And in this case, I would say, because we have these other initiatives coming on, and because we have aspirations of continuing perhaps a similar type of streetscape improvements even along 38, we have to try to figure out how to get this this balanced out in a way that actually results in a landscape that's beautiful and a street that's beautiful. So I encourage us thinking about this, and I encourage us to try to find the balance, which is to say that I think we should be willing to step up as a city perhaps with some resources and to better resource this and hold up our side of the street. But also, I think, see if we can't encourage through similar processes that we've looked at in these other things that we're doing, to encourage the owners to live up to their things that they agreed to, and or to strike new agreements and to find partnership.
Mr. Matthews.
Do we, as I recall, Harlan there, Walmart on the other side's in Lakeside, is it not? So do we have
That's correct, north of 44th, yeah.
Do we have any intergovernmental agreements with Lakeside? And like when Walmart went in, did Lakeside impose any landscaping requirements on them? And what are we doing to coordinate between the two entities?
Yeah, as far as when the streetscape was done, I'm not aware there was any kind of IGA or agreement with Lakeside. And I know whenever we do any kind of improvements or maintenance to those streets, we joint share with them. Like, for example, we overlaid Harlan about 3-4 years ago, and we only did our half of the street. We did contact Lakeside and say, hey, we're doing Harlan, would you like to join us and pay for your half of the street? And they said no. And then conversely, last year, 44th, we did the whole thing because they did want to participate. So we do have those talks with them, yeah.
who owns the medians, and how does, and with left turn pockets and stuff, how do the medians play into this?
Yeah, well, it generally, I can give the maintenance of, or the overlay of 44th last year as an example. We figured out a cost share with them based on, you know, where the property line between the two cities falls. I think generally it's down the middle, and we share that, but that was all spelled out in the IGA that we did at the time that we improved 44th. But some of these things that were done in the past like this, yeah, we don't really have any history of an agreement in place that I'm aware of.
But Mr. Matthews, I think as I read it and as I sort of remember the street, north of 44th, from 44th to 48th, it's only on the west side, which is Wheat Ridge. So I think on the east side, where it would be Lakeside, is not, it hasn't been approved.
Well, that was my question. Are we doing anything to coordinate with them so we have a consistency across the entire streetscape? And then how do you cut the baby in half in the middle of the median? Do we do rock over here and they have something else over on this side or whatever? Have we approached them to make a coordinated effort so the street looks consistent across the full width?
Thank you. Ms. Fitzgerald.
Scott, you mentioned that when the project was originally done back in the 2000 or whenever, there was a general understanding between the city and the homeowners. Is there any kind of a written agreement as to who's going to do what? And have we contacted those property owners and asked them to do their part, clean up their site or whatever it is?
No, we have not contacted the property owners other than isolated incidents where we get a complaint from a property owner and tell them that there was an agreement in place back at the time that they would take care of it. I believe we do have those written agreements in our files. I haven't located those, but apparently they're there.
Okay, is there anything in titles, any conditions in property titles to that effect?
Not that I'm aware without doing more research, right?
Mr. Ann?
So by getting the go-ahead from us this evening, you can reach out to all those business owners, property owners, correct? And then kind of put together a plan, resource, let us know what our cost would be, what the responsibility on their end would be, and you can bring all that back to us so we can make a final decision.
Yeah, we could put something together with that.
Or partly that, Monica, or we're looking for a little bit more direction maybe tonight. Do you want us to continue enforcing the original agreements, whatever they were? That was before Scott and my time, so we'd have to do the research on that. Or the city just take them over and maintain them, or something in between. You can see that city didn't put in irrigation. Allegedly, the agreement was that the property owners were supposed to take care of it. But I think we've seen numerous times that doesn't work very well in the community, and Joyce Manwaring's still here. Not to put her on the spot, but we have 72 or so traffic calming islands across the city that we kind of had arrangements to with. A lot of them might have been handshake arrangements, I don't know. There was a lot of history with those, asking that the neighbor said, well, we'll take care of it, and then a tree dies, and then we go out, we pull the tree out and put a rock in instead, because a lot of those aren't irrigated either. So I think we kind of want a bigger discussion of, do we want to still try to maintain those relationships and enforce it and say, property owners, you're responsible, you need to take care of this? Are you guys willing to do that? Or do you want the city, this is potentially a major corridor. I think that's why this was done back in the early 2000s, because this was a main entryway off the interstate into the city. And the city council at that time wanted to dress it up. So should the city just take the responsibility and dress this corridor up, or enforce it and make property owners do it?
Yeah, for me personally, I'd like to see us work together with the business owners, property owners, and the city to figure out a solution here and see how that would work moving forward.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess in my talks with homeowners who have approached me on this particular issue is that they believe it to be the city's responsibility to maintain these right-of-ways, and that it is the city has either always done that or that was their recollection from the time that it was built. And so setting that aside, I guess the other larger question, if you're talking about a bigger picture here, is that should we go forward with the Wadsworth widening plan, we're going to have strips on both sides that are going to have to be maintained to a significant degree, and how much of that is CDOT's and how much of that is ours. But I think that from a practical standpoint, as best we can, when we're doing these streetscapes, that they should be zero-scaped so that we're not in a situation where we're having to water a tree where there is no water. But as far as asking the homeowners to take this on now, I think it may be a case-by-case basis. On the commercial properties, there might be some language relative to that agreement, but unless we have a written agreement signed by that particular homeowner, I don't know how we can enforce that requirement on them. And so I'd like to see us do a better job and either landscaping it so it's zero-scaped, or finding those agreements and seeing how they apply to the current homeowner.
Yeah, I guess aside from streets like this, I mean citywide, most of the streets in the city, the local streets, property owners do take care of their yards and their turf all the way up to the curb. These have been treated a little differently just because the city went in and invested in, lighting and hardscape and some of those things and their, entryways. So it was looked at a little different, the city investment, city commitment. So, so how we want to handle that, I think that's part of the bigger discussion tonight. And even Wadsworth, once we get through the plan with that, how does that get maintained? Do we put in resources for contract services? Do we create a special service district where businesses pay in a certain amount for fees? There's all sorts of ways that can be handled, but I think it's just identifying that up front and making it clear to everybody through long-term agreements.
Ms. Davis?
So I would kind of like to have a happy medium. I think, George started off with discussing that, and then Zach followed up with discussing that this isn't going to be the only place that we're going to run into this. I mean, we already mentioned Wadsworth, 38th Avenue, and I think that the more we can do something like, I know you said like a business district or, whatever it might be, arrangement that we could kind of share it would be nice. I do think like in this situation, perhaps what we could do is approach these folks and bring it up to back up to quality, and then say, hey, would you agree if we bring this back up to quality that you would help us maintain it? And then, so that would be my suggestion, is perhaps bring it back to where we would like to see it and ask those folks to help out. And then with that in mind, I know one of the things you also said was consistency. Should it look consistent down the way? So you see one person has grass, one person has really big river rock. And maybe, I don't know that I want to make someone who just put all this river rock in have us put turf there, because again, I think it goes back to Mr. Urban and the zero-scaping. And it might be that person's choice. Like if they commit to, get irrigation and keep the grass green, knock yourself out. If someone's like, I don't really want to have much to do with it, but, get my leaf blower out there and blow it, a couple times a year, then maybe we do a river rock type of thing. So those are just my comments. I do think we need to do something. I think ideally, in my opinion, I'd like to do something to get it up to par again, and then get some agreement with the owners, property owners, that they would then follow suit and maintain it.
Ms. Hoppy?
I think that in this particular, so overall, and in general overall, yes, we're going to have some future plans to try to find something in the middle, and I support that, and I know that will take longer public outreach and a little more studying. For this particular street, it's not unheard of to have a property owner take care of the piece of property in front of their house, and it happens in Denver all the time, where you're responsible for the piece on the other side of the sidewalk before the street. But I think that if we're telling them that they have to maintain that, I don't think it's necessarily fair to tell them what they have to maintain. One of the things, when I lived in Denver in our house, we had big trees and we couldn't keep grass there, so we ended up with rocks because that was the growing environment that was in that space. So Yes, helping them bring the area up to where it looks nicer than a dirt patch with some weeds growing out of the sides, absolutely. Necessarily dictating what they have to put there, I'm not so sure, because what if somebody doesn't have the means to mow a patch of grass and to maintain a patch of grass the whole time? So I support both what Ms. Davis said, Mr. Pond and Mr. Urban, and I think that we should have more discussions about this in a large way, and then if we want to get into the weeds of Harlan, then we should have that conversation also.
Mr. Pond and then Ms. Dozman.
I would just add some clarity to this specifically, and then ultimately how we get to the broader picture, which is, I do think that in this case that we should do an analysis of the conditions, which you've started to do, and an analysis of the agreements. It should pull those out and look at them, and frankly come back to us, I think, and give us some solutions, because I do believe what I'm hearing is there's some options, like, let's make them take care of it, but don't tell them how to take care of it. And I think that's one solution and reaction, and has some consequences. Another one might be, it's too disconnected from an irrigation system. If we want it actually to be alive, we need to take it over, and we have to invest in that. Here's the capital investment of it, but then it'll be the same and it'll be beautiful, whatever. I don't want to predict what those things are. I'm just saying I think there should be an analysis of the conditions in the agreements, and then some options or solutions, and an analysis of those brought back to us. And maybe if we can go through this exercise and figure out some of these things, it'll be a good template for some of the other projects that we've talked about.
So I'll just make a few comments. My parents bought a house on Harlan in 2010, and the former homeowner passed on the understanding to them that it was their responsibility to take care of the right-of-way to a certain extent. So my father does mow the property, or mow the strip. The tree actually had died, and so the city came and removed it, but he waters the grass that is there slightly. And so I would say that understanding, that agreement is there to a certain extent. But I would say if we are creating programs in which we are enforcing private business owners to maintain their landscape, I feel like it's the city's responsibility to maintain the landscape that they put in to these streetscape projects. I don't think it's too much to ask for property owners to maintain it to a certain extent, but if we have droughts imposed on us, water restrictions, I wouldn't want the homeowners to have to, water any beyond the point in which they are capable of. So I would say that xeriscaping is definitely a great idea, and I think that we really need to be forward-thinking in future projects as to what kind of streetscape projects that we are going to be implementing, and what that looks like as far as the city versus private responsibilities.
Mr. Brink, I had a couple of questions myself. We have streetscape on 38th Avenue between Sheridan and Harlan. We've got it on 29th Avenue between Sheridan and Fenton, and we have it on Harlan. Those are the sort of the three, and I think were all done about the same time, and maybe somewhat typical. Who maintains 38th Avenue between Sheridan and Harlan?
The city contracts that out. Nope, the city does it.
Okay. So, just talking about equity between our business districts, is there equity to go to Harlan and the business owners on Harlan, and go to 29th Avenue and the business owners on 29th Avenue and say, well, 38th Avenue, we're going to pay for, you do what you can on Harlan. So, I think we ought to look at an equity issue there. I happen to be a landowner on 29th Avenue. I bought about 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. I don't recall the seller telling me, but by the way, and it's a couple of trees and some hardscapes, so it's and we maintain it, but it's not significant, but because it's not sod and it's not growing, so those are.
Yeah, you're correct in that the three areas you talk about, they're all constructed kind of uniquely different. Because I know on 38, the sidewalk is, a pretty fair distance back behind the curb, at least wide enough that the turf can grow. There is irrigation in there, so it does make a difference there. So easier to maintain, whether it's the city or the property owner.
And I'll tell you, on 29th Avenue, all of the side streets, Ames, Benton, Chase, Depew, Eaton, and Fenton, all have tree lawns on those named streets, and all of the doors for the houses on those streets orient to those. So you get to 29th Avenue, it's sort of like, well, I'm on the corner of 29th and Benton or whatever. My orientation is to Benton Street, and maybe I maintain Benton to sort of swing around and say, well, I've got 120-foot frontage on 29th Avenue that's got some large trees and some, various kinds of growies in there. It's not, I think we, need to look at more of a global, as we're looking at it, more global strategy. And those are sort of the existing the existing streets, and then we're going to add new streets, and streetscape in there, but just something to consider. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess as sort of looking at this from a citywide perspective, if we had some kind of right-of-way management program, or at least identifying those areas of the right-of-way that the city would need to do some maintenance, whether that's the responsibility of the homeowner or the city, it can be decided on a per-property basis. But setting aside these issues of the streetscapes, we have additional right-of-way areas with utility easements and others that are either not maintained well or overgrown, and you have encroachments on those easements as well. So it's not just this right-of-way on the street. There's a variety of those different situations. And then the other issue is CDOT and the amount of right-of-way that they're required to maintain, and whether they're doing that or not, mowing on a regular basis or not. That also kind of impacts the right-of-way issue. So I think if we had a right-of-way program that identified the plots of land in which we share responsibilities, and then going from there and coming up with a maintenance plan would be appropriate.
And we do have a right-of-way maintenance program where we do contract out a lot of it, and it does address some of those we call them orphaned areas that nobody's taking care of, and they're not necessarily city property, but a lot of them are CDOT's property. And I believe we've shared that map with, I don't know if this current council has seen the map, but we do have a program that has certain areas in the city identified. Harlan Street is not on there. That could be something that gets added, if maybe that's an option that we could bring back and give you a cost on what that would look like. But we do have that, just not every corridor is on there.
Okay, Ms. Hoppy?
I'm wondering if Mr. Pond would like to make a consensus to what he was saying about the
Are you just saying a consensus for whatever I said before, or do I have to actually say it? How about a consensus to direct staff to conduct an analysis on the mentioned streetscape of the agreements and the conditions, and come back at a future study session to provide us some solutions and options, not only for that, but perhaps some programmatic things for the future.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
Maybe an evaluation of fairness between areas, right?
I put that into the category of that should be part of the solution. Sure, if we want to be deliberate about that, as I stated before, I think there should be a balanced approach to this that is equitable.
Mr. Matthews?
And just as a matter too, without reviewing and knowing what some of these previous agreements are, I'd have a hard time saying we need to enforce them and enforce that back. But also, in your analysis, I don't know if we need to break these down, but I'm thinking ahead, like, for instance, 38th Avenue is an arterial street from Kipling to Youngfield, but it's basically 50-50 residential. And so how are we going to enforce some of these streetscape requirements? And it alludes to what a lot of other people were saying, but I just want to bring it out specifically. If we're going to have a consistent streetscape all the way, some of those houses do front on 38th, some front on the side streets. We have to be able to address those equitably, where it's private residences and they don't have an income stream helping to feed those maintenance costs. And that happens even on Wadsworth in a few places.
Mr. Bond?
Yeah, I would say, hopefully it's clear that my consensus is for those issues to be kind of secondary, which is that we'll get to them, in due order, but the priority here is to analyze the issue here, Harlan Street, talk about some options and some solutions, and then maybe use that as a framework to take another step after that.
Okay, sense of the council? That's consensus on that. Mrs. Shaver?
I wanted to offer a little historic perspective. This is kind of deja vu, because I think probably about 20 years ago, I was in this very room discussing the same issue. And that strip of those median strips between north of 44th, between Wheat Ridge and Lakeside, it was like beating our heads against the wall to try to get Lakeside to cooperate. And they weren't interested then. Apparently they're not interested anymore. And finally, it was just a kind of a thing where, you know what, that's kind of the entrance to our city, and if they're not going to help, we're certainly not going to just mow and landscape half of it and leave their half look crummy. So the better part of wisdom just seemed to be mow and maintain the whole thing, because they got more money now, but back then, there really was nothing. So it's just like there's no issue that's new. It's just same thing, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Brink. All right, moving on to item number 3. This is special use permit criteria. Mr. Goff.
Ken Johnstone is here.
Welcome, Mr.
This item.
Johnstone. Have the floor.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. So earlier this year, I think it was Councilperson Hoppy and Duran who brought this topic to our attention, which is consideration of adding a criteria to our special use permit review criteria that would suggest some sort of analysis of an application's consistency with the city's comprehensive plan or applicable sub-area plans. So that's really the topic for tonight. We wanted to bring it back for just kind of full council direction. It's a fairly straightforward ordinance. We've taken the liberty with the city attorney's office to drafting what would be a 9th condition to the criterion, a 9th criterion that would be added to the list of 8 that are already included in the code and that are always considered when special use permit applications are made. As noted in the memo to you for this evening, we did kind of just describe our historical way of applying those criteria, which is that they don't have to necessarily all be met, but the language is in consideration of the extent to which the application demonstrates the following criteria have been met. So we've interpreted that language to give, not require necessarily full compliance with all of it, but a consideration of all that would be a 9th condition as well. Sometimes in evaluating those criteria as well, I would just note that we often would make a recommendation of a condition of approval that would require greater consistency, so alterations to the site or to the application or to the operations that would bring it into better compliance with those 8, and if council so desires, 9 criteria. So fairly straightforward ordinance. If council is so inclined, we could certainly move this forward fairly quickly to a first reading and a public hearing. Would require consideration by the Planning Commission. It would be an amendment to Chapter 26, so we'd get it to the Planning Commission and they would get you their recommendation as well.
Discussion? Mr. Fitzgerald.
Ken, how does the 9th condition attack the runs with land in perpetuity or temporarily? Is that a decision that you would make, or the person in your position would make, or?
Yeah, I think we evaluate that So as Mr. Fitzgerald was mentioning, we have the ability of approving special use permits in a variety of ways. We can approve them specific to an applicant. We can approve them for a limited duration of time or a fixed duration of time, or we can approve them in perpetuity. And I think how we approve those varies. If it's a special use permit application that we think the operations are going to be really critical, and we need to have a good understanding of who's going to be operating in it and how they're going to be operating in it, that we would oftentimes make it specific to that applicant. If, on the contrary, it's a special use permit that involves significant investment and significant physical changes to the property, that would, in that case, we'd often feel that it would be inconsistent to then say, oh, and it's only good for you for 10 years, right? That, you know, if you're going to make hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially of investment into the property or the building to accommodate whatever that particular special use permit is, then we would generally have it run in perpetuity. So I don't think this ninth criterion necessarily influences how we would view that, though, I mean, I suppose it could, right? I mean, if we often say that comprehensive plans, particularly sub-area plans, which are more focused on a specific corridor typically, are aspirational in nature, and you can't instantly get there. You have to kind of deal with the things that you have that are already there, right? So if you've got a site that has a significant investment, it might be an investment from 20, 30, 40 years ago, that lends itself to a certain land use. I think to come in then and say, well, but our sub-area plan says we want this land use, you know, I think there's just a process and a time to get there. So I don't think we'd necessarily start, you know, placing limits on the duration of approvals, because again, that is a hard conversation to have with a property owner that's going to have to make an investment in potentially acquiring the property and making certain improvements to comply with local codes and building codes. So it's very rare, I would say, for us to add conditions that limit the duration of the approval.
Ms. Hoppe?
Thank you, and thanks for your work on this. The kind of the reason why, and I'll speak for myself, but Mr. N and I spoke together about it before we asked for it to be added, but one of the examples or situations that came up that made me kind of think of this is that we've had two sort of recent special use permits that have been approved in the Fruitdale sub-area plan, or Fruitdale sub-area. So, I'm not trying to pigeonhole any specific business, so I'm not going to say business names or what they were, but one was someone who was leasing a property who wanted to operate a used car lot, and then one was someone who's thinking about purchasing a property who wanted to operate an automotive mechanic shop. In that area specifically, there are already used car lots very close, within like a block. There are already mechanic shops across the street from where these were approved, and they didn't necessarily go along with what the vision is for Fruitdale. And we do the work. We've got how many pages is this? 33-page document of the Fruitdale sub-area. And there are things in there that are things like work to promote Prospect Park and Historical Park as community assets, maintain and protect the established single-family character as well as agricultural character in portions of the area. In their future land use concepts, they're asking for things that the intent is to be proactive rather than reactive in identifying what the public and city would like to see in the future, and future land use concept is the basis for many of the goals and policies found in the plan. So recommending developing the 44th Avenue as an orchard district. We'll use car lot and another mechanic shop don't fall in with those plans. So we're spending a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of effort, and there were a lot of citizens that were a part of this, and there was multiple outreach. But then we're not considering that when we consider special uses, because it's not a criterion. So when they come and the question is, We had a neighbor of one of the uses, testify this isn't part of the Fruitdale sub-area plan. The response was, it's not part of the criterion for it to have to abide by those documents. And so the staff are doing what they're supposed to. They're following the process. We have what I feel like is kind of a hiccup in our process where we're not supporting these plans. So we spend the time to put together these vision documents and these plans, and we're not necessarily supporting them. And so I think that, there is definitely, if somebody already owns a property and they're trying to make some changes to it, then that carries more weight with me. But if they don't own the property and they're just a leasee, or not just a leasee, but a leasee, where they could lease somewhere else or they could purchase somewhere else, then I think that's something that we need to keep in mind is what are we trying to do with that area of our city? And so that's all that I have to say about it. I'll let Ms. Duran speak to her reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just echo what you've said, Janice, is we do have a plan here, and it was put in 2007. So a lot of work went behind this and a lot of time. And I just want us to be mindful and honor the fact of the process that they went through and realizing, I'm just repeating what you said, but it was called the Orchard District. They wanted to have a garden theme. This is what many citizens came in, they expressed their desire, this is what they wanted. Plus, we made a really huge investment in Fruitdale School. So I think we need to honor that. And, as you said, if they're leasing the property, yes. Having item number 9 on here, I don't think is really asking for a whole lot. I just want us to be mindful of this is Fruitdale, this is the Orchard area, and it's a really important part of our district and District 4, and we just need to make sure that we're mindful of that. And read through this, just kind of follow what their vision was here and what they're relying on us to do. And that's why I'm supporting this, and I'd like all of you to consider that too and give us a consensus.
Mr. Urban, and then Mr. Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess the way I look at this is the city has two roles in this regard. The first role that we have is with respect to what we did with the Swiss Flower Shop property, where we allowed for that investment to occur, and we promoted that investment in that project because it obviously does fit within the sub-area plan. But then the other role that we play is that we allow certain uses to exist or to be used on a particular property. And when you have a category called special use, that by its very definition tells me it's special, meaning that it's set apart and not in conformance with the surrounding area, and that's why it goes through that special use process. And so because the special use process already includes the requirement that it goes before council if there's some kind of objection or protest to the special use application, I think we already have that stopgap there for council to determine whether we want this to go forward or not. But to say that, if it doesn't meet the sub-area plan, it shouldn't be considered, that goes against the very definition of what a special use is that it is not the same, but it is different. So we should allow any number of applications to come forward to us and say yes or no versus just casting them out of hand and not giving them the due consideration, especially if a proposed use is being presented and there's no opposition to it. Why should we stand in that way? And it may be an interim use, it may be long-term use, but I don't think that we can necessarily dictate that, especially when we already have these controls in place. So I would be opposed to this just by the nature of special use is special.
Mr. Matthews?
Thank you. One of the things that I'm trying to figure out here is we have on 44th, we have a truck stop. We used to have a tire warehouse, a hotel. We have about a dozen bars. We have several construction companies. I'm not sure how those all relate to each other. We have now a vet down by Wadsworth. I guess before I could go any further, and I'll make an example, but I'd like to know exactly just what an orchard district is. Does that mean we scrape the whole 200 feet along 44th and put in cherry trees. I don't know. Let me give you an example. I was widening Jewel Avenue down by Kipling, from Kipling to Wadsworth years ago, and we had, part of it was as we went back into the right-of-way, of course, there were properties that were on the uphill side, and we had to go into those, and we built retaining walls, and they chose to use just landscape timber retaining walls because they said they wanted it to be rustic. Well, as I'm building this, the engineer comes and shuts me down and says, well, that's just not precise enough the way you're doing that. And he says, that's too rustic. And I'm asking him, tell me what too rustic means. And I think we're running into that situation here where we want to have an orchard district, but what does that mean, and how does that affect all the existing businesses that are there now?
Mr. Bond?
I don't fundamentally have a problem with the consideration of this being included, but I will say there's maybe a couple of problem points, that maybe we should just think about. Ultimately, I think this idea of substantial conformance that's a tough language, right? That's the pivot of how that criteria is met. Truthfully, you're rightfully holding up a sub-area plan because of some recent business. However, this is pointing to the general comprehensive plan as well, albeit, not sub-area plans, which obviously is even less specific, to Larry's point, about what is happening or what an orchard district is, because it doesn't even have a sub-area plan. And so substantial conformance in that case, very, very difficult, I think, to interpret. In other words, if something was a commercial district, okay, so I guess this is commercial, so we don't have that type of specificity built in, perhaps even at the sub-area plan level, I think but certainly not in the general area of the plans that aren't more specifically addressed. To be even more honest about this question, I would say, and I just throw this out for consideration, is that I will say that by the fact that we can make up our laws and we can ask people, we can say what's special, what's not special, and we can say what to do when it is special, and that's what we're doing. And I think it's totally fair for us to say, hey, by the way, so when it's a special use, you have to ask us for permission. That's, in these situations, and that's what this does. And oh, by the way, when you ask us for permission, we're going to be basing our judgment on these things. And I think it's okay in that case for us to add this, but I might say it's something like the proposed special use promotes the goals and outcomes of the applicable portion or something like that. And just consider that for a second, because it's more honest, frankly. As a criterion, we're trying to say, hey, we think this is in alignment with where we're intending to go based on these documents and based on our consensus. Now, it may or may not, I won't kind of chime in on whether everyone feels like that's fair or not to do to people with certain entitlements right now. I think that is something that we should think about, but I think it's in our, that would be very specifically help us in these cases, and I think we need to talk about how much help do we need in these cases, how much needs to be written down, how much are we going to encumber ourselves as when we adjudicate these things, and how much are we encumbering existing private property rights by making this change, if any. But I think we should talk about that and understand it. So anyway, that's it.
Ms. Dozman?
Thank you. So I would kind of mirror some of those comments, but I believe the comprehensive plan should definitely be a guiding document, but I don't think it should be the end-all be-all. As we've already recognized, we need to update it this year, and so it's an ever-evolving document. And for us to say that we should kind of adhere to certain sub-area plans, I feel is too restrictive, especially considering the current business and makeup of some of that corridor. I mean, I would love for District 4 to be an arts and nature district. That orchard district, it makes sense, and with the Fruitvale lofts going in and putting up orchard trees, I love that idea, but the fact of the matter is, it's a major arterial corridor with a lot of automotive businesses, a lot of truck stops, and so those land uses that we've already created through our zoning, they exist, and so some of those special permits that came up to council, they kind of just allowed for a use above what would normally be used for, but it's already in line with what they would be doing there. And so I don't want to be too restrictive as to say, okay, an automotive business does exist there, but you can't do major automotive work because we would rather see this there when the regular use of that property allows for automotive, maybe just not major automotive. And so I would really like for us to adhere to that comprehensive plan, but I don't know that it is necessary to add this criteria as far as like an umbrella.
Ms. Hoppy?
Mr. Johnson, can you just clarify for me, if someone is applying for a special use permit and they don't meet one of the criteria, then are they immediately not counted? Then are they immediately declined?
No.
Thank you. So, and honestly, I'm using Fruitdale as an example because it's an example that I've been a part of. I'm sure I could go back into the records in different parts of our community that have sub-area plans or that are, notified in our comprehensive plan. But these were two specific ones that I was a part of, and so that's why I'm using this as an example, right? It's an easy example. For me, because I was part of it. I do appreciate, the difference between substantial conformance and promotes goals and outcomes. It was kind of like my initial hope was that it would be a consideration. It's not an end all or a be all. It doesn't kick you out or kick you in. It would just be a consideration because it's a lot of consideration gone into the documents that we utilize. And, much like when when we define our goals for the city and, our different steps that we want to take to reach those goals, I think those also should be considerations for when we're doing things for our community and making ordinances and changing codes and stuff like that. So that's why I think that this is important to be a part of it. What I'd like to just kind of remind everybody is that special use permits are discretionary uses, so they don't have to be a yes and they don't have to be a no. And they have to prove a justification of need in that area also. And so those are the things that I would hope that everybody would consider while they're thinking about this.
Ms. Duran?
Thank you. Obviously, we can't change the direction the corridor has been for the last several years, but we can moving forward. Just being mindful of all the work and effort that was put in here. And I think having item number 9 just is a reminder to all of us when we're making this decision, let's not forget that we need to be mindful of our comprehensive plan or sub-area plan. It's just one more step just for all of us to be thinking of and for whoever's applying for that special use permit to be mindful of too. It's not a yes or a no, and it's not saying you can't do this. This is just saying, hey, look, we've got this in the city, so let's be mindful, let's think about it, and moving forward, we can make some changes and we can kind of change a little bit of that corridor. Of course, we're not going to get rid of everything that's there, but let's just be smart about this. That's all. Thank you.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
I guess I will assent to moving forward with this, although I'm an unhappy camper about this. Because, for example, what I heard Ken say is that it would be unfair to the landowner to give a conditional acceptance and that the right would run in perpetuity, which would make it very difficult to change the nature of any particular site. And using 44th as an example, if every used car lot there is okay forever, We will never change that. I don't think used car lots are an asset to the city. It's a compulsion of mine, but I guess 9 is a step forward, but it's not all. I want it to be stricter. I want to find more ways to honor the plans that we have and the vision that we have for our city as a whole and for an individual sub-area plan. So, because this is a step forward, I will assent to it. But as I say, I'm unhappy with this, and it looks to me like the desire to be fair to the landowner is going to prevent us. It means that the right is going to run with the land in perpetuity. So I'm unhappy about that. That's all. Thanks.
Mr. Pond?
Yeah, I'm sure Ken will jump in, and I hope I'm not wrong. And I don't want my partner to feel bad. So my interpretation of this is that we still, as a council or as a planning commission and or a staff, we still have all of the levers that to make a judgment about whether it should run with the land, run with the owner, or even stricter considerations in terms of giving it an end date and everything else. All of which I think take care of your concerns. So those things have never been taken off the table, and I actually then think your point, which is this 9th point or criteria, actually advances some of the things that that we want, which is for people to consider this and as they're adjudicating these things. And we still have all these levers. For instance, if it's making them think about that more, then they will hopefully be able to use the tool, like say, let's put a cap on this, or let's make it run with the owner, not with the land. And so I don't think that this means in every case or in any case, it just depends on how we decide to do it, that this means that everything's going to be perpetual.
Mr. Matthews?
Along those same lines, I just want to, I can vote for this, but before it comes to council to be put into code, I want to make sure that it just doesn't stop the process before it comes to us. I mean, that's why we're elected, is to make the hard decisions. And whenever it's just like I'm against mandatory sentencing, because it takes the thought process out of what's fair. And just as long as we don't hamstring people bringing things before their elected officials, I'm fine with trying to remind ourselves that there is a plan out there that we should try to follow if we can.
Ms. Hoppy?
I think I'm going to try for a consensus. Did you just have your hand up? Okay. I'd like to ask for a consensus that we direct staff to move forward with the 9th criterion. The proposed special use is in, or promotes the goals and outcomes of sub-area plan, or of applicable portions of the city's comprehensive plan and any sub-area plan applicable to the subject property, and that they move forward with a recommendation to take it to Planning Commission. Does that work? Does that make sense?
It does, but that was modified language, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, if you could just get that to me, that'd be most helpful. Thank you.
Sorry, consensus?
So let me count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Looks like we have a consensus on that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That concludes item number 3. We will move to item number 4, which is amendment to the code to allow electric fences under certain circumstances. Mr. Goff.
Mr. Johnstone is on again, and the chief is here, and Mr. Dahl is here too for any backup that's needed.
Thank you, sir. So this is a new topic that we haven't had really conversations with council before, but city code currently is silent to the topic of electric fences. So we don't have anything to specifically look at. Historically, and this certainly, as I understand it, precedes my time at the city, we've interpreted our code to prohibit the installation of electric fences. There's a section in the sign code that identifies prohibited fences, and one of the types of prohibited fences is any fence that would represent a hazard to a person's health or safety. So again, historically, as a policy matter, we've interpreted the notion of an electric fence to have the potential to cause a hazard to a person's health or safety, and as such, we've defined them as prohibited fences. Back in 2014, as you heard earlier from Mr. Pate, Kettleson Campers, along with the company Electric Guard Dog, approached the city about the possibility of an electric fence at that property just off of Kipling. Our initial direction to them was to inform them of that policy that the city had historically deemed electric fences to be prohibited. They were persistent for good reason, both as an Electric Guard Dog business and as Kettleson Campers. As you've heard, some of the criminal activity out there is real, and they were looking for solutions that would limit their exposure, and this seemed like a good solution to them. The initial proposal had been for an electric fence to be installed inside the perimeter of the existing 6-foot fence that's out there, and to inset it about a foot from the inside of the perimeter of the existing fence, and to install it at a height of 10 feet is their preferred design height. Ultimately, after some back and forth with the applicant, they submitted an application for an administrative variance. Administrative variances can be approved for up to 50% of the development standard. So in the case of fences, our maximum fence height is typically 6 feet. So the maximum variance request that could be requested administratively was for a 9-foot fence. So they modified their design to be that distance. In reviewing and approving that variance request administratively, we did involve the school as well, the facilities staff, and I think to some extent the principal at the time were involved in kind of that, providing input. I mean, obviously it was our decision to make as the jurisdiction, having jurisdiction on fence regulations, but we wanted to involve our important partner being the school district. And the school district did initially have some pretty significant concerns about the safety, or I think equally the perceived safety of potentially having an electric fence bordering an elementary school property. So ultimately, I did authorize an administrative variance. It had 3 conditions of approval. Condition 1 was that it be set back 3 feet inside the existing 6-foot chain link fence for safety reasons. And the reason for that was, our thinking at the time was that if one were to reach through the fence to, for whatever reason, that would prohibit someone from reaching through and kind of an arm's length limitation of coming into contact with that electric fence. The second condition was that the electric fence be turned off after normal business hours, and the third condition was that the portion adjacent to the school district actually not be electrified. I don't want to speak on behalf of the applicant, but I think it's safe to say they generally didn't agree with those conditions. They had desired for it to be set back, again, just the 1 foot. And I think I maybe didn't fully realize this at the time, but they really were concerned with not having the ability to electrify it adjacent to the school. They were, I think, okay, as has been recommunicated tonight, with turning it off or turning it on only during after normal business hours. That being said, the applicant did not appeal those conditions of approval to the Board of Adjustment. But later, in early 2015, so that all happened in 2014, in early 2015, Electric Guard Dog did appeal staff's interpretation that those 3 conditions are required in order for such a fence to not be considered a danger to a person's safety and therefore prohibited. That appeal went to the Board of Adjustment. The Board of Adjustment basically reaffirmed staff's interpretation that those 3 conditions are reasonable for that type of offense to not be considered a prohibited fence under our code. So fast forward to 2018, Electric Guard Dog became re-engaged. It's our understanding that some of the criminal activity on the site has increased now that with Camping World now being the operators of the property. Electric Guard Dog and Kettleson reached out to council members Dosman and Matthews and explained their concerns and their desires. Subsequently, the council persons reached out to our city manager, and ultimately all parties sat down and met, including representatives from Kettleson and from Kettleson, Camping World, and Electric Guard Dog. The challenge that we have now is that because the board basically affirmed the interpretation that those three conditions are necessary for the electric fence not to be prohibited, it's not a simple task to simply administratively consider another variance application that would vary any of those three conditions. So really we're before you tonight to suggest that if this topic is a topic that council as a body wants to tackle, it's really a legislative solution that would be needed to say when and in what manner, under what conditions, and what zoning districts electric fences might be permitted in the city. So that's really what we're here to introduce as a topic tonight. We did include a little bit of a summary, just anecdotal, not a comprehensive search, but we did try and track down responses from some other jurisdictions as to whether they do or don't allow electric fences and in what manner. And we've included that information in the council memo as well. So we look forward to your direction.
Ms. Hoppy?
Just to clarify this, so we're here today to not look at, as I'm reading through it, we're not looking at the changing, administratively changing this. Currently, we're looking at, should we change it, right? Should we look at it?
Should you look at?
Looking at it, should we look at it? Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Do you want to tackle the topic of electric fences? If not, the Board of Adjustment, with its written affirmation of our interpretation, electric fences might be allowed in the city on a case-by-case basis, subject to that 3-foot setback from the other perimeter fence, amongst other things.
Mr. Pond?
I have to say it's my preference that we don't create a legislative action. However, I understand the bind that you're in as I interpret this, and I would ask a couple of questions related to the Board of Adjustment decision, and we don't have the minutes, I don't believe, in this packet, but it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is very much coming down to either the distance and perceived or actual safety issues in the relationship between two fences, a perimeter fence and electrified fence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so and 3 foot's too much, 1 foot may be okay, and of course this ordinance doesn't even specify a distance or a safety criterion, so that's an issue. But did the board have specific comments as to why they determined 3 foot was the right number and 1 foot was the wrong number? Or did they talk about opening size, fence, other fence issues? Can you recap that?
Not accurately. Okay. I haven't gone back to look at those minutes either. I don't think they talked much about different dimensional requirements, because really the only thing in front of them was 3 foot, a reasonable condition, and they determined that it was.
So my take on this, I would prefer not to go down a legislative route, because I think that it has, being able to handle these things on the case by case, in this case, gotten very close to being resolved, and the school was an issue. It sounds like that's not an issue anymore. And I would say that it seems reasonable to me to go back to the Board of Adjustment, not to ask them to, to change their mind so much as to more specifically get into the issues and to perhaps kind of hone in on our safety expectations and see if they could reconsider under those conditions. And I don't know why that. I mean, I guess I understand why you think it's kind of going back to the well, but I think if it's done so in a way that we either think there's new information or a new interpretation of the issue, or better way to get to it, I would still prefer to do it that way. So I'd like to hear why we really, really can't, and that we really have to do an ordinance.
And I don't know if our city attorney would want to opine on that at all.
Should I bring your chair? Please, sir. Sure. Neil, happy to stand. Of course, the constraint is we've got, now 2 Board of Adjustment decisions. One's at a foot saying no, and one at 3 saying yes, but that didn't work for the applicant. And I think what happens is that, those interpretations are now kind of their binding interpretation for electric fences in those fact patterns. So you almost put the applicant in the position of playing the wrong rock game. Okay, what about this rock? Will that work? And I get it that Councilmember Pond's concern is that should we really have a legislative solution? That's the problem. You've got 2 already. What ends up happening is the company comes up with a very specific thing they want to do, and without any real guidance, they take that through the staff, and ultimately, if it ends up at the Board of Adjustment, and then there's with the greatest respect to the Board of Adjustment, kind of a messy hearing around just kind of that fact pattern, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't, for them, and that's a pretty time-consuming process throughout. One thing I might throw out, you've just finished talking about special use permits, and those, I'm not saying necessarily that's the legislative solution, but you might well consider that that's a little bit like a BOA situation, but you have a lot more control, I think, over designing the parameters of what the applicant wants, working with staff for that, and being able to apply it.
Mr. Pond?
Yeah, I appreciate that interpretation. I like that idea very much. Again, that's kind of quasi-legislative. Just changing the designation of this, I would assume, to a special use, and if that's possible. So, because otherwise I think if we are in some ways trying to sidestep what's already been, considered and determined by the Board of Adjustment, then of course we're not taking our own advice as to why it wasn't a foot or whatever, and I would then ask for more specificity in this ordinance and the meetings of that Board of Adjustment and a whole bunch of other things in order for me to figure out whether I felt comfortable with this ordinance as an example.
Mr. Matthews?
Thank you. I'd like to clarify a few things that came out in our meetings. In a way, electric fence is almost a misnomer. If you're thinking it's some kind of chain link or 6x6 chicken wire or what have you fence, it's not. It's just horizontal wires stretched on poles about 9 inches to a foot apart that aren't in and of themselves structurally designed to keep somebody out. In fact, Aurora calls it an electric alarm. It's permitted in Aurora as an electric alarm. The reason for the 3-foot separation not being viable is because you have a 3-foot no man's land in between the 6-foot chain link fence and the electric alarm, and how do you maintain that? And if you let weeds grow in there, you're out of spec, and also it gives people that are interested in breaking in a 3-foot no man's land where they can come up over the chain link fence, and with 3 feet of clearance, they can come down here and take an insulated wire cutters and boom, boom, boom. So there are reasons why they wanted that close to the existing perimeter fence. In this particular situation, the existing 6-foot chain link fence that's there is slatted, and they don't have the cheap slats, they have the heavy duty slats. So it's an opaque, solid surface, if you will. It's not just chain link where someone's sticking their fingers through. And that would remain and they'd be happy with that to remain as a condition for getting this accomplished. They've tried guard dogs, but there's a liability issue there, and guard dogs don't particularly seem to be a viable solution in this case. I agree with the representative from Guard Dog, Electric Dog, we had cameras in our construction yards, and when we realized something was missing, we got to go back and take a look at it and watch them take our stuff, and that's all it amounted to. I mean, I watched a guy break into one of our one-ton traffic control trucks, take the operator's hard hat and vest that he had left in there, put it on, start the truck, back it up to an arrow board, and drive it out of our yard. And we never even got a police response on a stolen vehicle. I mean, that's just the way it is, was in that case. But cameras are not a preventive. They're just simply you can watch what happened and know what happened to your stuff. This has been an ongoing problem, and it's becoming increasingly severe. And as a city, we do have, I think, a responsibility to all of our stakeholders to help give them a safe environment in which to take care of their business in our town. I think it is valid. As he mentioned, there have been 3 lockdowns over there at the school because of criminal activity taking place that campers have no control over. If we can kind of take this with a grain of salt, but the attractive nuisance part out of there to where we're not attracting the criminals, then that cuts down on the safety issue for everybody. I think an important issue that everyone needs to consider is these are not like cattle guards. They're not really fences per se. They are alarms. Cattle fences, the old electric single farm wire fence, has significantly more voltage and significantly more bite than what these electric fences have. They've been certified as safe by IEEE, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they have been tested. And the safety issue, I'm just not sure, is more of a perceived issue than an actual issue. And I'll let you guys consider that for a few minutes.
Additional discussion, Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When I'm looking at a business in Wheat Ridge trying to protect their inventory so that they can then turn around and sell that inventory to support our sales tax base, and they're telling us that they need this particular device to do business well and safely in the city, I have to consider that and try to figure out how can we make this happen, because in my mind, if this is what this business wants to do and it's not completely unsafe, it's well protected, and they've gone through the requirements to make sure that it is a safe apparatus, I think we should find a way to move it forward, because again, at the end of the day, this is only helping our sales tax revenue by encouraging businesses to remain in the city versus telling them that they're on their own as far as it goes with these theft issues that keep coming up. But I think either going through the special use process would be a smart move in this regard, because it does allow us to keep it to this particular instance and this particular property, unless there are other businesses in the city that are currently considering these types of fences. I think using that special use permit would take care of this one particular property and allow us to move forward without concerning ourselves with other fences elsewhere. But I'd be of the mind to allow some kind of special use permit to go forward.
Ms. Hoppy?
I'm in support of also doing the special use permit if that's if our only options are change it legislatively or do a special use permit or decline it, then I'm in support of the special use permit over the other ways. Unless there is something else. Is there a door number 4, Mr. Dahl?
Usually there's only 3.
Only 3.
And I should tell you, special use permit, we need to bring an ordinance forward to amend the code to allow that, and I think you understand that, but I just want to make sure you did. One of the things that occurs to me is each fact pattern is a little unique, and as mentioned by Councilmember Urban here, we have Pennington Elementary School. There may well be no other use of this kind of facility that also is bordering a school, and that's why sort of a regular code section doesn't really take notice of pretty important facts like that, and it was important to the school, whereas a special use permit process, that's what it's for. You send out notices and people show up, and you're able to more carefully design it.
Ms. Davis?
So I would support as well moving forward to make sure that we get these folks what they need, if it's through a special use permit, a change in some of the ordinance to allow for this, whatever. But I do think that they've been very patient, and I think along the way they've also lost a lot of property and had damages. So I only know how I'd feel, and I'd be pretty irate. And I do think with that in mind, there are certain instances where some more safety precautions might be in order. A school, like you were saying, adjacent to a school, those types of things. I would be interested, now that Mr. Matthews had said that people call them electric alarm, or however he called them, to look to see if cities have it that way and not electric fence. Because he was just saying Aurora has it, but in our notes it says they don't have it. So it'd be curious if we looked it up through other cities, how they're wording these things, just to see that. And I do know the voltage. I know this is an aside. I have an underground one in my front yard for my dogs. They have to wear a collar. But even when you touch it, it's not like you have to get beaten off with a broom to it just gives you a little tickle. So I mean, I think the thing is that they're safe. I mean, they're safe, and they're not, again, like people would think, electric fence. So I think we have to kind of get that misnomer out too. That
We can drill down into the ordinances that are out there and
yeah.
see what distinctions are made. Some cities, I'm sure, make the distinction, others probably don't, but we can further educate ourselves.
Mr. Matthews?
I didn't get a copy, but I have a letter here from headquarters at Guard Dog that details 16 municipalities, or not all municipalities, but that's where I got my information. 16 government agencies, if you will, that allow for them, and some of them are administrative modification through the fire department and a zoning permit. That's the city of Denver. It varies on how they approach them. But she just gave us a sample of 16, and I'm going to call them municipalities, some are counties, that do allow them here in the state. One of the things I noted here is that we do allow, correct me if I'm wrong, but we allow barbed wire fences.
In agricultural zone districts.
And we have a lot of R2 and what have you, and to me, a barbed wire fence is more dangerous to a child than this electric fence. If you ride your bike into a barbed wire fence, my gosh, if you ride your bike into this fence, you get ping, and then it goes off and you're done. You don't have to worry about infection and stitches.
Additional comments, Ms. Duran?
I just want to thank everyone for the work they've done on here. I'm in support of the special use permit. It also gives me some relief knowing that it's just going to be turned on during normal business hours. So that's some relief for me, so thank you.
Ms. Dozman?
So I really appreciate everyone's comments and all of the work that staff has done on this, especially working with the district and the school board. As a Pennington parent and the District 4 councilwoman, we have a significant amount of crime in that area, and it was a concern of the school that there was a potential of the electrified fence or a student coming in contact with an electrified fence. However, I think they've come to a compromise in keeping it off during school hours, and so that I think that's an important factor to note. And I really just appreciate you bringing this to us so quickly, because I would like to resolve this issue. I am also in favor of a special use permit. What would that look like exactly? What would that process look like from here?
Well, we'd bring forward an ordinance that would define what this is, allow it as a special use, probably a special accessory use, I'm making it up as I go on, in given zone districts, then identify conditions that were available to be imposed on that permit as conditions of the issuance of the permit. One of the conditions clearly would be timing of when the system, whatever it is, is electrified, et cetera, along the lines of the various things that have been discussed here. And then you'd know in a given zone district that a special use permit is available for you to apply for. You make that application, and of course, under our system, that application goes first to the Community Development Director and can be approved by the Community Development Director. And if there's a protest, then it goes up. So it'd be, you know, potentially fully administrative, depending. And frankly, in front of the Community Development Director, it's an informal process, and that's really where the discussion between the given SUP, special use permit applicant, and the developer director would take place. You kind of craft and design the conditions, and then you get the permit.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews.
And would you have an estimated general time frame for this process to take place?
Drafting of the ordinance?
Well, whatever we have to do to get to an end product, I'd like to have some kind of target date.
Yeah.
Well, the soonest we could do first reading at this point is June 11th, and then second reading would be June 25th when it would become effective. Unless we can rush it to the May 14th meeting, which means we have to draft an ordinance does it have to go to planning?
Yeah.
Oh, it has to go to planning, so.
Although you can affect that by doing first reading and then
Planning in between.
Planning in between. We often do that to save time. And secondly, you can, as you well know, make it effective upon adoption on second reading, save you that additional 15 days, 2 weeks, so we can do that.
I'm sure they and Lee and I would both appreciate if we can, and not trying to create a false sense of urgency here, but they're getting attacked almost every weekend. And the sooner we can do this, the better.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Maybe the chief would like to tell us about the comparative incidence of crime at this location compared to like locations and compared to crime in the city as a whole.
Chief?
I have all that information right off the top of my head. No, I don't. What I can tell you is, I believe last year is when Kettleson sold the business, the end of 16, early 17, sold the business to Camping World. So last year, we didn't have a whole lot of crime reports at that location. Doesn't mean there wasn't crime going on there. They just weren't reporting it to us. Year to date this year, there have been 10 reported incidents of crime. I don't know that my records don't reflect the amount that Mr. Pate referred to, and I don't know if he was talking about multiple years at $250,000 or this year or last year, but the information that we've got, at least in terms of what's been reported to us, of course, that's not the end product, that's the initial report is far less than that. But 10 significant break-ins there where campers were broken into. At the first of the year, right before the first of the year, somebody drove into their building and stole a bunch of generators. So what I can tell you is the people that stole generators have been arrested. They were arrested down in Mexico. And we just this week made arrests of the individuals, two individuals who were transient that we think were responsible for the majority of the burglaries at Kettleson and the burglary at Brinkman Construction over at 38th and Watts. So that's sort of what crime looks like over there. Is Mr. Pate related? These people are breaking in all throughout the perimeter of that property. So east side, west side, south side, north side. In driving through. But that's what crime looks like there. The crime at the Camping World over at 4100 Youngfield looks a little different. We only had one auto theft report there last year. So if I can't tell you for sure that there's no additional crime going on there. I know a couple of years ago we had some trespasses to campers over there, but we caught the individuals associated with that as well. So if people aren't reporting crime, it's really difficult to say that there's crime. There was a comment earlier that there were 3 lockdowns at Pennington as a result of criminal activity at Kettleson. That's not accurate. I spoke to the principal there. There's been 1 lockdown with a student who reported a man with a gun who was bleeding in the auxiliary classrooms they have. They went into full lockdown. We responded, extensive search. We didn't locate anybody. So don't know if somebody was there or not, but certainly not able to locate anybody. And then 2 other what they call lockouts. It's a much lower grade of situation where somebody might see some suspicious activity. But according to Principal Craig, they can't tie any of those specifically and directly to Kettleson. So, I think you all are aware, I've said it many times, the I-70 and Kipling corridor is sort of a hot spot for criminal activity. It's generally more around the hotels and motels, the lower tier hotels and motels in that area. And over the last couple of years, the city has certainly experienced a lot more transient sort of activity up there. So, how that ties into crime overall in the city or crime specifically at this area, is, it's difficult to say, and it's difficult to compare one location to another location because it is about location. And, some locations tend to generate more crime, because of where they're at than other locations do. But there's no doubt that Kettleson campers over the years, certainly my time as a chief, has been impacted significantly by, break-ins and trespasses to their trailers over there. So, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Fitzgerald?
I would note that this situation is one that has been considered twice, I believe, by the Board of Adjustment. And I was on council when it was discussed before. And at that point, council approved the Board of Adjustment end product. The situation is exactly the same. In other words, when they came to us before, it was with exactly the same issue. And we tried to point out that there was a public good in protecting children from this fence. And maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't heard any compromises on their part. Other than maybe the agreement to shut off the fence during the 7 to 7 time period, is that correct? So they have not in any way compromised. So I can't vote for a legislative solution, or I guess I could vote for some sort of special use consideration, but they've come to us before. We gave them a way to do it, and they didn't take it.
I can speak to that real quickly. Ms. Dozman did mention earlier that the school district did have some concerns originally, but I've spoken to their facilities manager about this recently, and they understand the issues that Kettleson's going through, and they want to make sure that they can protect their property. And I told them that this go around they've agreed to shut off the fence during the school hours. So for the school district, that really helped them get them over the edge, and they don't feel that it's a big of a safety issue. So that was one of our biggest concerns, because their school district reached out to us and said they had concerns. So, but they seem to be okay with it now. So if that helps you.
Ms. Dozman.
All right, I'd like to try to reach a consensus. I'd like to direct staff to create an ordinance to allow for electric fences with a special use permit.
I have one question before.
Sure.
Mr. Urban?
Sorry. what's the difference between a special use permit and making an amendment to a development plan? So most of these properties are located in some kind of planned development. Could they make an amendment to that planned development to include this use, or does it need to be a special use permit?
They certainly could, Mr. Urban. I think this might be a simpler solution. The planned development, those are essentially rezonings, so they require individualized review, greater notice requirements. Whereas if council were to approve an ordinance that makes these SUPs in some way, then as has been described, the review process moving forward for individual sites is simply an administrative process initially, as long as we can reach agreement on conditions of approval. So moving forward, it'll be a simpler process to consider site-specific proposals.
Okay, thank you.
Now can we
All
reach a
right.
consensus?
Okay, let's see. We have consensus to move forward in that direction.
From a schedule standpoint, you were asking, the packet for May 15th is out already, or is it?
So can
packets
we
due?
have it no later than June 11th?
Yeah, with the schedule I've got, that I talked with Ken about briefly, is June 11, first reading. June 21, we can get Planning Commission because this is Chapter 26 amendment. June 28th, City Council, we can make it effective. June 25th, sorry. June 25th, City Council, we can make it effective on approval. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Good discussion. Thank you. Everyone okay to move forward on item number 5? Okay. Item number 5 is freestanding emergency rooms. Do we have a presentation on that?
We do. Mr. Johnstone again.
Oh, Mr. Johnstone, please.
Okay, one more. As council is likely aware, but this predates probably a couple of you, we've been having a series of different moratoria, is that the plural of moratorium? On freestanding emergency rooms or freestanding emergency departments. They're kind of referred to with both nomenclatures since April of 2016. The moratoriums, I'll say, have been in place in large part to see if the state would adopt regulations that would either preempt the need for the local jurisdictions to adopt regulations, or at least influence how we might go about regulating these uses. They are a use that started to become more popular in Colorado, about in that 2015, 2016 timeframe. They probably existed elsewhere for longer periods of times in other parts of the country and other states. And some states have chosen to create a regulatory environment around them at a state level, and our state house has been talking about doing that for several years, but have thus far failed to act, except for this year. I have to retract some of my language, I think, in the memo that suggested that it didn't seem like they were ever going to take action at the State House. They actually have. So 2 laws have been signed by the governor on April 25th related to some kind of monitoring of cost information that the industry would be responsible for, and then information that would be disclosed to potential patients on site at the time of arriving at these facilities, so that they kind of understand some of what they do and don't offer. And then I understand there's a pending bill that's in a committee that would require some additional licensure for these facilities as well. So that's, if other people.
Yeah, it was postponed.
Oh, okay.
2 days ago.
Okay, okay. So that last licensure requirement was apparently, right, was killed in committee. So, so I don't know if those have helped us or hurt us. I don't know if Carol, do you think they'll do anything more, or is this kind of the?
Well, why don't you come to the microphone and introduce yourself, and then we can discuss this. Why don't you try the stand-up mic, or go there, sit down with us. Okay.
So Carol Salzman with Lutheran Medical Center. I'm the Vice President for Community and Government Affairs. So House Bill 18-1212 was the bill that had to do with licensure. and it was killed in the Veterans Affairs Committee last week. That one in particular was the one that we were hopeful would have affected maybe how you did your licensing here. If it would have gone as a clean licensure bill, there probably would have been about a 2-year period where the state would have looked at how are we going to license these. That bill did not pass because it also included language around pricing and pricing disclosures, and the two could not come to an agreement, so it was killed. So at this point, you know, the two that passed are not going to really help you with your regulatory decisions today. So, sorry.
So, as a local matter, when we were first made aware of the potential for these facilities, and we had one potential end user that was looking at a location that was zoned mixed-use neighborhood, and they and we made the determination that that the use is closer to a hospital than it is a medical office, and as such is allowed in locations where zoning allows hospitals. In the city of Wheat Ridge, that's really 2 areas, properties that are zoned planned hospital as part of an outline development plan, or that are zoned another planned district that allows hospitals as one of the permitted uses, and in mixed-use commercial zone districts. So it's really those zone districts where you could potentially locate these. Clear Creek Crossing was recently rezoned through the ODP process, and as I think Council is aware, Planning Area 1 of that planned district does allow hospitals as well. And of course, the example of Lutheran property is zoned planned hospital district. In terms of mixed-use commercial, you know, we have a fair amount of mixed-use commercial. The Wadsworth corridor was primarily rezoned to MUC as part of a city council legislative rezoning back in 2012, I believe. So that's kind of where they are allowed right now in the city. So where do we stand? I think there's probably some things that the city could do in the licensure arena at a local level, if you so desired. That's not really my bailiwick per se, and we haven't really discussed what that might look like. From a zoning standpoint, you know, we probably do have some options. You could do nothing, right, and they would continue to be allowed in those mixed-use commercial and planned districts, as I've described. Or we could also extend the moratorium. Wouldn't necessarily recommend that option. Just it feels like maybe the state has done what the state's going to do, and at some point we maybe just need to decide what, if anything, we want to do at a local level. And then, of course, option number 3 would be to start drafting local regulations. Right? We've talked a lot about, you know, special use permits. You know, that's certainly an option. We could define them in our code and prohibit them in all zoning districts. As I think Councilmember Hoppe noted earlier, one of the evaluation criteria that we use for special use permits is a demonstration of need. So we don't necessarily always use that intensely when we evaluate a special use permit, but that could be an appropriate factor to take into consideration when if we were to get such an application, and if it were to be required by code to go through an SUP process. So there's probably a variety of nuances in between in terms of what we could do from a zoning standpoint. I think the desire tonight is to see if one or another of those options makes sense for council, and to the extent that you do want to look at some local regulations that allow them or disallow them, any kind of preliminary direction you'd want to provide. I don't have it right in front of me, but I'm pretty sure the date of expiration of the current moratorium is August 25th. So we've got a little bit of time to get things done, but I think we'd just soon get started probably as soon as possible, because this too will require some drafting, and then it too will require a hearing before the Planning Commission.
Discussion from council. Ms. Duran.
So an SUP would kind of be like a certificate of need. Same thing?
It could be. One of the, in that criteria section, there's a discussion about evaluating the need for the use. So we could, I know there's been a lot of concern that these aren't necessarily, there isn't as much need for these types of facilities in a city like Wheat Ridge that has a hospital in the center of the city. You know, I think, as I understand the business model, when they first started cropping up in certain areas, it was often in rural areas where there may not be great access to readily available emergency medical services, and that need might look a lot different than the need in Wheat Ridge, which is pretty central in the Denver area and has access to ERs that are associated with hospitals.
Sure, because I still have the same concerns today as I did when we first started talking about this, right? Just the cost. If you're out of network, Medicaid and Medicare don't always reimburse either. So I'm just trying to figure out, is this really a need that we have, and is it worth the investment? So I'm still kind of, the same place I was before.
Ms. Davis?
So it's funny because I think this discussion circles back around to one of the discussions we had earlier regarding our plans for the city and land usage and that type of thing. And I think this is a discussion we had earlier too about need. And again, I know one of the ones that was in question was going to be in our major commercial corridor on Wadsworth. And so I think, again, as a city, if we're trying to put in a vision of what our corridor should be looking like or what certain areas should be looking like, I guess kind of going back to what Ms. Duran was saying, kind of going back to previous conversations, I think adding another freestanding emergency room or building is not a benefit to our city or to our constituents. And I think the House bills that did pass kind of alludes to how people are a little bit confused when they go into these, that their services are going to be less. It's going to be more of a urgent care type of area, which it's not. You'll get billed just like if you walked into a hospital, and then sadly, oftentimes you might have to have an ambulance bill to go to a real hospital because they don't have the services there that you need. So I don't want to go with option one of do nothing. I would like to begin a process of adopting some local regulations that really restrict, if not completely prohibit, freestanding emergency rooms, because I think we do have enough around us in our surrounding cities, and then we do have a hospital in our area, and then we do have, I know at Clear Creek Crossing there was that distinction to allow a healthcare facility. I don't think it'd be an emergency room, but who knows? But I just don't think it's a benefit from a land usage or for our community and our constituents.
Mr. Matthews?
I think if we're going to move forward on this, I think we have to move forward with a two-pronged approach. And I think a lot of the issues and a lot of the controversy that's been surrounding freestanding emergency rooms is people think they're going to urgent care, and then all of a sudden they get a $10,000 bill. So without addressing both these issues, and how do we differentiate, and how do our citizens differentiate? I mean, if they're at home and they've just tried to half cut their finger off building a fence around their house or something, and the saw slipped, they don't always have time to check their insurance and to check references and go through 6 steps. They just want to get somewhere to stop the bleeding. So I'm against just doing emergency freestanding rooms only. I think we have to consider it doing both so that we have a comprehensive policy, and maybe we do eliminate eventually freestanding emergency rooms. That would not hurt my feelings any, but let's proceed with caution that way and figure out how we differentiate some of these different medical facilities.
Ms. Hoppy?
Thank you. I agree with Ms. Davis. Much like when we were looking at storage units and the amount of storage units that were just outside of our city and what we had inside of our city, and we addressed that by we have a specific amount of land to use in our community. And do we want to spend that bank on things like storage units? And I, just like with freestanding ERs, I don't want to spend our land bank on those. And I don't feel like we have a need, and so I don't feel like, it's need-based to have one in our community. And I don't think that we should, just let the moratorium expire or kick the can down the road. So we've got time. I agree with option 2 and, beginning the process of looking at regulations for freestanding emergency rooms and whether we don't allow them in our code at all, or if we only allow them in very specific places with like mileage in between, to make sure that we don't end up with a bunch of them in different areas. If that's the way we address it, then either way, I'm good with both of those.
Ms. Dozeman, and then Mr. Pond.
So I just wanted some clarification. I think Mr. Johnstone can speak to this. So it said that with the code being silent to this specific use, that its use is determined to be most similar to a hospital. I was made to believe that silent language meant expressly prohibited. So why is there kind of a difference in this situation?
I think I did. You'll tell me if I didn't. The default position in our code, there's language that says if a use is not expressly permitted, it may be deemed to be prohibited, right? That silence is meaningful. There's also kind of the exact contrary language that says, oh, and by the way, a use can be found to be similar to a listed use and therefore permitted, or whatever that similar use is, if it's a special use or permitted use. And that's the language really that we used here. I mean, they're providing hospital room emergency services essentially. So we felt it appropriate to say that seems real similar to a hospital. We did not feel it was appropriate to say it's similar to medical office, right? Because we do think it's more intensive than medical office, and medical office is then defined or is allowed in more mixed use and lower intensity commercial zoning districts.
So just as a follow-up, so if the code is silent to this specific use, wouldn't that mean that if we do nothing, it wouldn't be permitted?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we've made the interpretation. We could certainly change it, but the interpretation that we've made thus far has been that it's very similar and frankly, I would say less intensive than a full-on hospital use, but that it's most similar to a hospital use and therefore regulated in the same manner that hospitals are regulated.
Mr. Pond?
I agree. It seems that our only real way forward is option 2 on this, from this packet. So I do support that. I will perhaps insert into that I'm a little bit concerned about our pace. For instance, I don't believe, frankly, that if we were to look at draft regulations in June and that was all we did, that would be enough for me. If possible, I want to see some options with this. I mean, I agree with there's a range that we've bracketed in this discussion from having special use designation, some suite of restrictions or conditions and or complete, essentially prohibition of it. So, I mean, I think we do need, to have some of those options come back to us and to be able to track what the pros and cons or the mechanisms of those things and why. But I will say that there's 2 issues that have come up that I think are important. One is just the planning and land use that we've already talked about, and that's why I do, support moving forward with option 2 and talking about special use or other things that allow us to track it just that way. And I think the need-based piece also is a consumer issue, and I think that being able to have, whether it's a couple study sessions on it or an open house or something like that allows us to communicate a little bit more and helps penetrate the kind of discussion into the consumer market so that we can get some feedback on it, but we can also provide some education on it at the same time. I think would be useful if we can squeeze that into the time.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess as I look at this, I I'd like to see us focus more on what we can do to regulate and license these entities, and I think that will help us with our land use issues. And as it relates to this licensing and regulation of these entities, I'd much prefer the state to take care of that for us, but it's like the construction defect bill, they just couldn't get it done, so we had to do it ourselves. And in this regard, I think there's 5 different areas that we need to consider when we're doing this regulation. The first aspect is the licensing. So what is their licensing background? What is their licensing cadre, if you will, as far as where they've been licensed and who has licensed them? That also includes that statement of need and those types of issues. But the other areas are the operating requirements. What hours are they holding? What is their compliance with the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, as well as what type of products or services that we're going to require on site. So in order to be considered an emergency room, you have to have defibrillator, you have to have X-ray, you have to have ultrasound, you have to have pediatric equipment, those types of things. But then also the on-site staffing requirements. So if this is being billed as an emergency room, then there must be a physician on site 24 hours a day if that's the operating hours. So because the state hasn't been able to come up with these regulations, that sort of leaves us to do that. And I think if we're going to do this, we need to include these different elements, because if we're not, the consumers are left without any protections as far as what they're walking into. So those would be my requests.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald.
I've got to say, I would go with option 2. I think we do need to handle this because apparently the state is not going to. And I think Mr. Urban just now expressed a lot of my concerns, because to be honest, I can't say this applies to all, but I think the business plan of some of these freestanding emergency rooms is to charge hospital emergency room costs for relatively inexpensive procedures, and to send off to a real hospital emergency room those that are going to be more expensive. So I would like to go with option 2. I'd like to make sure that we don't in any way fool the customer into thinking that he's going to get honest to goodness real emergency room care. If you're having a heart attack, for example, time is of the essence, and you don't want to go into a facility where there isn't a doctor on staff at present, and you wait around for somebody to come in from some other location, and then they put you in an ambulance, and you get charged for that, and you go to a real hospital. So I think we ought to do this, and we ought to make sure that patients know what it's going to cost them, what insurance is covered, and what operations can't be done at that center.
Thank you, Mr. Ann.
I think option 2 gives us that ability to have all these discussions and make these decisions. Also, can we look at, I know Arvada has some freestanding ERs in the surrounding area. Can we look at their regulations and what they're doing and bring that back to us?
Certainly.
All right, thank you.
Do we think we have a consensus out there?
I'll make a consensus to move forward with option 2.
Okay. Any other questions, or does that conclude it for you?
It does.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good discussion there. So that concludes the action items. We can go to elected official reports. Ms. Dozeman.
Yeah, so I just wanted to alert the community to 3 events that are going on in our city this weekend. So Saturday, May 12th, we have the 44th Avenue Rumble from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. at Anderson Park off of 44th and Field. That same day, we also have the Everett Resource Fair going on at Everett Middle School from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. They'll be serving hot dogs, and they'll have a lot of booths set up for resources for Wheat Ridge families. And that same day again, Saturday, May 12th, we have the Maypole Festival that is going to be at the Wheat Ridge Historical Society, and that is on 44th and Robb Street.
Thank you. Mr. Pond? Nothing tonight? Ms. Davis? Thank you. Mr. Fitzgerald? Nothing? Thank you. Mr. Matthews?
Yeah, I would like for all council members to consider something here, because Councilman Fitzgerald brought us something that, as far as these electric fences, our crime problem, and part of that's tied in with our transient problem and what have you, that it's the same old discussion we had 2, 3, 4 years ago. And I think it would behoove us as a council to become proactive and take a look at an area like Kipling and I-70 and say, what can we do to help alleviate some of the crime issues in some of these specific high-impact areas of our city. I wish Chief would have stayed, but I would just like to bring it out for everyone to be thinking about. If we don't do it now, it gets worse. You read about cities, bigger cities, Seattle, Portland, in places where they have just kicked the can down the road, to use that old worn-out phrase, and now they have real problems. San Francisco uses, I think they have a $60 million street cleaning budget, and they use $30 million of that to clean up needles and feces off the streets. And I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but I'm using that as an example. It's better to be proactive, and let's start trying to figure out what to do now while it may still be an attainable goal.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to remind you, that is on your top 5 as an issue. So we'll be scheduling many study sessions, hopefully, in the next several months.
Working to address those very, very important points. Mr. Urban?
I'm good this evening, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hoppe?
Nothing tonight, thanks.
Ms. Duran?
Nothing tonight, thank you.
Ms. Shaver?
I do. That's another topic that got discussed 20 years ago. And in fact, you know, our 10% lodgers tax, we put that on the ballot, and it was enacted to raise funds to spend at 44th and Kipling. The I-70 and Kipling corridor. And
just half of it, 5% of it.
okay.
And it's the whole city.
But was to be, and some of it could be used for aesthetic, you know, like weed patches that were, you wanted it to be grass instead. You know, we got the entrance sign there, that big entrance sign, that was an improvement. But part of it was supposed to be for enforcement and all that. And I don't, that's kind of gone by the wayside. Some of it was for, I mean, Camelot was just so bad, and those apartments, and to do some code enforcement. I know you've talked about rental property inspection things, and you kind of don't want to go there, but that was so bad that they wanted to increase the inspection of just those facilities down in that little corner area. So you can talk about that again, looks like we did 20 years ago, and it's still a problem.
Good. I don't have anything further. Thank you all.
I do.
I
do. I'm sorry. I do.
Okay.
Couple things. I'll go as quick as possible. Just was alerted that there's some emergency work going on by CDOT on the Highway 58 flyover eastbound, and Denver Water had 44th Avenue shut for their work, and that was supposed to be the detour route. So we're working with Denver Water to get 44th open. So this may run through morning rush hour. So just a heads up on that. Also, real quickly, the city and other Jefferson County cities have been contacted by a law firm about an opiate litigation that's going on nationally. Spites and Warwick is the law firm. They're co-counsel with Motley Rice, who's the co-lead counsel on the National Prescription Opiate Litigation, which is being coordinated in the Northern District of Ohio. Currently, there are about 200 lawsuits filed in federal court, and with more than 50 defendants and hundreds of government claimants. This law firm that contacted us is working with about 6 entities, mostly in South Colorado right now. Alamosa, if you followed some of the reports, you know, they had some major issues down there. Jefferson County, Lakewood, and Arvada are all considering joining on potentially to a lawsuit. Spites and Warwick would like to represent Wheat Ridge and potentially other communities in Jefferson County on this. It's not a class action suit, it's a multi-district litigation case. The bad news is they want a decision quickly because there's a settlement hearing set for May 10th, which is in a few days. And if that may get postponed, we're not sure, but if we don't give some direction that we want to join on, we may be left out. There'd be no cost to the cities. It's a contingent-based settlement, so if the city does get any settlement, the attorneys would take 25% of it, the city would get 75%. Basically what this law firm would do, they would come to our city, they would get the appropriate data that they need to analyze what the impacts have been of the opioid crisis in Wheat Ridge specifically, how much it's cost potentially our police department, our hospital potentially, our fire departments. So it's, sorry to throw this at you at the last minute, but they kind of threw it at us. There's not much time. Again, they may delay the settlement hearing. So I'm not sure if May 10th is the actual deadline or not, but Mr. Dahl may have some comments, I'm not sure. But there's really, as far as we know, there's no risk to the city. Again, there's no cost to the city. If there's no settlement, we don't get anything. If there's a settlement, we potentially get 75% of what these attorneys can prove are damages to Wheat Ridge from the opiate crisis.
Mr. Matthews.
Oops, sorry.
I'm sorry, I mean, who's paying who's the defendant? It's a class action suit, but who all is going to be putting out all the money?
The defense are all the pharmaceutical distributors and companies. There's numerous ones that are part of these different lawsuits.
So we're going after the manufacturers and not the prescribers?
There might be prescribers in there too. I don't know. I don't have those details, unfortunately. So I don't know. They didn't give me the names of all the different defendants. I think it's primarily the pharmaceutical companies. It's not going after doctors. It's going after the pharmaceutical companies. They said the reason they're doing this is, it says, among the claims within the multi-district litigation are that the pharmaceutical industry deceptively marketed highly addictive prescription painkillers, thereby contributing to a growing epidemic. So I believe most of the defendants, if not all, are pharmaceutical companies, not prescribers. They're not going after doctors, is my understanding.
Additional discussion.
So it's I guess, yeah.
We're looking for a sense of the council.
Yep. If this is something you want to put your name on or get involved in.
I guess I have a really hard time making a decision on the fly about that.
It is. I get it. I mean, you have to if potentially, unless they postpone the hearing or it gets pushed out. We can bring this back at a later time if there's still an option to join, if you don't want to make a decision tonight.
Mr. Pond?
Yeah, I would say there's too many gaps of information, and to the extent that it gets extended beyond this week and we have a chance to discuss it with more background information, sure. But I would propose passing if we have to make the decision tonight. Pass on the 10th.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Well, actually, I was going to ask for consensus, but it looks like I don't have it, so I think I'll back off.
Likewise, I don't think we have enough time to consider it, and at the same time, it appears as though the majority of the opioid crisis that we're facing is in the illegal use of heroin as opposed to the legal prescription of opioids, where this lawsuit appears to be focused on the pharmaceutical companies. As much as they may have a part to play, it doesn't seem like it's what's happening here as it relates to the opioid crisis.
I think it is different, yeah.
Mr. Matthews?
In an effort to do an informal call to question, I'd like to make a consensus that we pass on this unless we have more time to study the issue.
Okay. Thank you. There you go. Anything further?
That's all I have.
Okay. I have nothing. Thank you very much. We'll stand adjourned.